Okay, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. I know there's about 50 other panels happening, so we appreciate you coming to this one, and we will try to make it worth your while. So my name is Charlie DeRivers. I am the XCEPT Research Fund and Uptake Director. The XCEPT Research Fund is a commissioning platform as part of the XCEPT program. I'll just say a little thing about XCEPT, because this session today is being convened by XCEPT, which stands for the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Program. So we are one of the UK government's largest conflict research programs, and we're funded by UK International Development through the UK government's FCDO Research and Evidence Directorate. Our mandate is to explore dynamics in conflict-affected borderlands, how conflicts connect across borders and regions, and the drivers of violent and peaceful behavior. The program is managed by Chemonics, I'm from Chemonics, and the Asia Foundation, working with some of our core partners, Chatham House, which we've got two representatives here, King's College London, Conciliation Resources, Rift Valley Institute, and the Malcolm Kerr Carnegie Middle East Centre. And then through the XCEPT Research Fund, we also bring in a lot of other partners. I think we've got about 30 other partners that come in through that doing more short-term research. So on the panel today, we have three XCEPT-affiliated researchers, Renard, Tim, and Nathan. And they'll be discussing some of their work in East and West Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And if you're interested in finding out anything more about XCEPT, go and talk to them, come and talk to me. There's also Poppy in the corner there, who you can go and talk to as well. But anyway, that is XCEPT. So, the purpose of today, and just say we're very excited to be here. Thank you, IAC, for inviting us. We're going to be exploring the intersection of corruption and violent conflict across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. So at the root of many violent conflicts lies political corruption, impunity, elite capture, and a lack of accountability seed grievance, stimulate reform, and undermine conflict recovery. So this workshop will discuss the link between corruption and conflict, highlighting considerations for tackling corruption as an element of conflict reduction, resolution, and prevention. And we have a fantastic panel to discuss this today. We've got Dr. Erica Gaston, Head of Conflict Prevention and Sustaining Peace at the UN University's Centre for Policy Research. We've got Dr. Renard Mansour, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, and the Principal Investigator of Chatham House's XCEPT Research. We've got Tim Eaton, a Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House as well, and a lead researcher on the XCEPT program. And then Nathan Scher, Assistant Director of the Asia Foundation's Conflict and Fragility Unit and Program Manager of XCEPT's Local Research Network. I should say we were also hoping to have one of our local researchers, Dan Seng Lorn, join us. He's the director of the Kachinland Research Centre based in Myanmar, but unfortunately it was logistically very difficult to bring him here. But Nathan will be able to represent some of Dan Seng's research, and also, of course, brings his own expert knowledge on Myanmar. So in terms of the format, we'll try to keep it relatively informal. I'll ask kind of 3 to 4 questions to our expert audience. You are experts, but our expert panel, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience. So the first bit will probably take about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to chat. Okay, so we'll get right into it, and let's get into the meat of it straight away. So we're looking at the link between conflict and corruption. So let's start with that. How are violent conflicts linked to corruption? And Eric, I'll start with you. We'll kind of go from more or less west to east. Erica, you've been looking at conflict, organized crime in Central African Republic, Mali. What do you see as the link?
Yeah, right. Thanks very much. Thanks to everyone for joining. I think this panel is a little bit going to bring in some different elements maybe from some of the others, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion. What I'll be presenting from, we had a year-long research project where we looked at multilateral responses to transnational organized crime in conflict-affected areas. So we had case studies in Mali and the Central African Republic, but we also had a global policy paper that was looking writ large, what is the multilateral system doing to respond to these? And across these, we were looking not only at how do these different forms of illicit trafficking, organized crime, all of which are interlinked with corruption, how are they affecting conflict drivers, and what have been the responses to them? And of course, these span, a range of different illicit markets. So in Mali and Central African Republic, we're looking at everything from sort of smuggling and illicit trade in diamonds and gold to, illegal checkpoints and taxation by armed groups to other types of, large-scale transiting in terms of drugs and arms trafficking going through both areas. But I also want to emphasize that even though, we often come up against these things and think about them in parts of the Sahel and organized criminal economies in those areas, this is not something that's limited to traditional conflict zones. So when we looked at our broader global policy paper, we also look at examples where, the government of Ecuador in the last year has declared that it's in an internal armed conflict against criminal groups and narco-terrorists. You have what's been happening recently in Haiti, where organized gangs effectively resulted in the takedown of the government there. In the last decade, violence levels in countries like Mexico, due to cartels or other places where there are organized crime, have topped or been on a par with those contributing from traditional sources of crime. So this is a major effect that's not just limited to organized criminal areas. Now, in terms of the exact linkage, like how do we see corruption feeding conflict, conflict feeding corruption? Traditionally within the academic literature, I've got my foot in both the academic and policy worlds, you think about it in terms of how do these different sources like organized crime actually enable means of conflict to go on. So obviously things like smuggling and arms and weapons make those more available for different types of armed groups to use. All of the different profits that they get from drug smuggling or other forms of illicit trade just give them more money to build and empower sort of militias or whatever weapons they're using. But I want to kind of go beyond that and think also about what the sort of secondary effects are. So not just are they having more men at arms, more weapons to use, but all the other ways as these groups are empowered because they've got more money and more arms, they're disrupting state services, it's disrupting the state's ability to actually intercede in some of these things, also contributing to corruption, and thereby doing all of these other things that seed conflict grievances and affect the root causes of conflict. So it's this entire chain. It's not just they're using it for, drugs and money. And I want to give one particular example in Mali because I think also sometimes we can have this static assumption that it always was this way and there always was illicit trade, but there can be particular spikes or phenomenon that emerge in particular areas that really ratchet up the conflict and drive a crisis. So in Mali, of course, it's right on the edge of the Sahara. It's always for centuries been at the span of cross-border trade that's been happening, from west to northern to Central Africa and largely it's been unregulated. This part has not been controlled by the state. But there was a particular phenomenon that happened starting in the 1990s and into the early 2000s that really ratcheted up in terms of its conflict. And that was that you suddenly had this spike in high-value commodities coming through. Initially cigarettes, then hashish, and then increasingly cocaine coming in from Latin America, going up through North Africa into Europe. And what happened with these high-value commodities is they suddenly increased the protection values. So that means they increase the amount of men and arms you need to protect your cut in that trade, but also protection from the state. Because whereas the Malian state didn't particularly care about getting its slice of the trade in, say, butter and oil or ghee or whatever it was that was coming through informally before, it's under much more pressure to regulate hashish and particularly cocaine. And so it requires government collusion, it requires higher pricing to buy them in. And so what you start to get is this self-reinforcing cycle of militarization and also government complicity in arms. And that does two things. One, it's a problem in itself. It definitely eroded a lot of the trust in the Malian government. If you're an average citizen in Mali and you're asked about criminal problems and protection in the state, you're like, I see the criminal groups, I see the government, they're same to me. So that's also a problem, but it also means because they're bought into this system, it closes down a lot of the avenues that you would have to seek solutions to that problem. And so these factors, this element of organized crime and trafficking, were really seen as strong antecedents to the 2012 crisis in which the government lost control of much of northern Mali, and the state essentially came into a little bit of, its state of collapse. So It was a very, very strong contributor, and it's continued with that cycle since then. So overall, I think what we want to think about in terms of conflict and corruption is not just those, the sort of the obvious triggers or even low-level petty corruption, how much is the government taking, but how is it affecting that basic state-society compact and building into the political system?
Thank you, Erica. Yes, yes, I think something really important about what you're saying is, it's a system, right? There's a conflict system, and there's these feedback loops, and I think that's very useful. Also, pulling out the importance of the second order effects. I'll go to Tim next. We'll stay in Africa. So, Tim, could you answer the same question? What's in your case studies? I know you've been looking at Libya, also, that supply chain going down Niger, Nigeria. What do you see as the link between corruption and conflict in your case study?
Thank you, Charlie, and great to be here. Thank you for everyone for joining. So I think in keeping with the trends of what Erica was mentioning there, I think you definitely see this nexus of conflict, crime, and corruption in Libya as being inextricably linked, and certainly part of a system that, rather than simply being an externality or the product of some bad apples, actually is increasingly the organizing logic of the way that the system works. And that, of course, produces many challenges. There's been a lot of ways of characterizing this. I was listening to a panel on state capture yesterday. Terms such as kleptocracy are often used as well. For me, I think I tend to use the term kind of a conflict economy that's emerged in Libya, and particularly the illicit and the criminal aspects have become increasingly important within that. So I think just to characterize that to start, what we see in Libya today is a product of a long process that at its origin is a conflict over the dispute of legitimate authority. And of course, following the 2011 revolution in Libya, the collapse of its security sector led to effectively the rapid proliferation of localized forces. And those forces, after the conflict, actually grew much faster, and there are many more joining armed groups after the conflict than during it, to the extent that today we don't really know how many men-at-arms there are in Libya, but we think there are something like 400,000, which out of a population of 7 million is an incredibly high number. And I think that what this shows is that over time in particular, it's these particularly local armed groups that have been effective in penetrating the state, becoming representatives of the state, and entrenching their interests in politics and economics to the extent that they have become the driving force behind what happens in the country. So political authority has remained pretty fragmented and unconsolidated by particular groups, yet the security sector has increasingly tended to drive the governance dynamics. And what this has effectively done is create this cycle of competition for the resources of the state, for parcels of the state, in which these various security actors and elites can benefit, obtain power and authority, and obtain a segment or a portion of Libya's oil wealth. And what that's meant is that rather than producing public goods out of the system and producing services for the population, what we've increasingly seen is that these interest groups have become more and more powerful, more and more influential, to the extent that today, while there are two governments claiming authority, both of the ministers of interior of those governments are militiamen. And that really is a shift. And as the bargaining between these groups has accelerated, there's been some consolidation, and increasingly there are fewer and fewer groups who are able to access the resources of the state directly. And this has particularly created a kind of kleptocratic boom of of benefits for those who are able to access the resources of the state, and has effectively led to the institutionalization of corruption, was the term used by one of the top anti-corruption officials, whereby the state is being used as a vehicle specifically to fund those interests. And so here, I think we'll talk a bit later in the example of the transnational movement of people and human smuggling and trafficking. But the practical result of this, that a limited number of actors are becoming increasingly enriched through their impunity to engage in corrupt activities and the diversion of state resources. And the state, which employs the vast majority of the population, is producing less and less, so that when in September 2023 you see a disaster such as that befell Derna with the dams bursting, there was a flaw at every level of the state's response. The money that was supposed to have been put forward for the dam's maintenance was leaked out in corrupt contracts. The inability to agree on budgets or systems meant that the money that was mobilized wasn't spent. And then on top of that, nobody would take responsibility for their actions. Not one public official resigned following the Derna crisis, in which 8,000 people are reported dead, but the number is in reality much, much higher, which I think shows that the product of the system, whilst there isn't a widespread conflict between rival actors in Libya, the system is effectively predicated on the distribution of resources among the elites to maintain the stability that we see, and that hurts the population significantly. And you can see in the aftermath of the Derna crisis, what's actually happened is that the reconstruction fund that's been formed has been another vehicle for major institutionalized corruption. So I think this kind of shows the depth of the problem, in that effectively the status quo is one of the powerful actors agreeing for a percentage of the country's wealth, but not according that with any responsibility to meaningfully govern with it.
Thanks, Tim. And I think, I pulled out a few things from that. Corruption being, the organizing logic of the way the system works, as you described it, a conflict economy, and the way that local armed groups have become part of the system, and entrenched that corrupt system. And I know, Renard, that's something that you've looked at as well, in terms of the way the political settlement has entrenched a corrupt system. So we're moving across to the Middle East now. So could you speak a bit to that, and how you see the link between corruption and conflict in your case studies?
Sure. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, everyone. I guess the way that I would answer that question is, we're talking about corruption and violence, both of which are politically sanctioned. And so they're not necessarily illegal in terms of they are the rules of the game in the countries that we're looking at. And so I would classify these states of impunity. So whereas on paper you could have rules and laws, in reality, de facto, you have ruling elites in countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, the case that we look at, who sit above the rule of law, who are untouchable. And I think you have the same in the case studies today. And so the question then becomes, how do we think about the architecture of corruption, or the mechanisms of corruption? What does it look like, and how does that then link to violence? And so you see across the Middle East several sort of important mechanisms. Anything from, for example, bureaucracy is important. Ruling elites who have impunity will employ their people into senior positions of the civil service across these countries. Why? To procure contracts, to generate revenue, and also to employ people to build a social base. So they're able to use their impunity as their social power to tap into the state bureaucratically. Another mechanism is the legal mechanism that's come up for two reasons. One, controlling the legal mechanism gives you the impunity you need, but it also allows you to weaponize a very powerful tool against opponents. And so a legal mechanism becomes another important aspect to the types of corrupt systems we're seeing. A third one becomes military. And many of these ruling elites, for them to maintain their impunity, need private access to arms. And so you see that across the countries that we're looking at in the Middle East, the ones that I've mentioned, having access to private securities is important for ensuring impunity that allows an elite to sit above the system and to benefit from corruption. Another mechanism that's important is ideology. The irony of these elites is none of them are willing to admit this. They will all be anti-corruption crusaders. They will all be Democrats. They will all have elections. These ideological points of being anti-corruption is important. Of course, for them, the way they really mean anti-corruption is to go after their opponents who are also corrupt. But ideologically, corruption is important for these countries. So these are, I think, as we begin to develop what this type of politically sanctioned corruption looks like, these are some of the mechanisms to, I think, keep in mind in terms of states of impunity and effectively corruption being the rules of the game. What corruption gives us is a lens to understand the politics, but also the violence. So that, let's say, a militia linked to the axis of resistance, which is at war right now against Israel and the US in the Middle East, that violence is allowed. These missile strikes are allowed because it's part of the system. It's often defending the system. And so it's inclusive violence to these political settlements. And so when we get to the conversation of violence, we see corruption both fueling violence and, of course, violence maintaining the corruption, which I've mentioned. But the ways in which violence fuels corruption, corruption fuels violence, you could have it directly, where you see the access to repressive apparatus, access to coercion, allowing elites to repress populations, to stop protest, to stop accountability. But you also see it in structural forms. A very common example used across countries is corruption in the medical sector. For example, when it comes to pharmaceuticals and medicine, when you have elites who take control of ministries of health or public procurement of medicines, they then generate revenue, but the consequence of that is you don't have medicine that is fit for consumption, which means that people are dying indirectly as well. So it's not just that the militias and police are killing, but indirectly you have countless people dying in these countries. In Iraq, we did something for XCEPT, looking at how medicine travels across the region, and we found that 70% of medicine in Iraq is either fake or expired, unfit for consumption. The first order effect of that is people aren't having good medicine. The second order impact of that is people don't trust the medical system. They won't go to hospitals. So you have first and order impacts across the board here. And you can say similar things for corruption in the electricity sector, which means that people don't have air conditioning, for example, when countries can become very hot. Corruption in the water sector, corruption in the wheat sector, where you have bread that has poison in it or noodles that have poison in it. So corruption across essential services is killing people every day. And so that becomes the connection, I think, between corruption and violence. And so to conclude then, I think it is obviously, as Tim says, a conflict economy that we're talking about. But when we start talking about approaches to it, I think treating it as something that is illegal or illicit stops short of the reality, which is this is a structure that's there, this is a governing system, and really the key, as you see, is this impunity, I think. And so accountability becomes an important conversation.
Thanks, Renard. Yes, and just that's helpful thinking through those different mechanisms, the bureaucracy, legal, the importance of private access to arms, ideology, that's an interesting side of it. And also picking up on that point, how violence is linked into that, both as part of the system, but then the impacts of that as well, direct violence, structural violence. I think that's a helpful frame. Nathan, we'll go to you now all the way over in Myanmar. Do you want to pick up on that point of the link between corruption and conflict in the area that you've been studying with Dan Seng Long and the the Asia Foundation team.
Yeah. No, thanks, Charlie. And it's great to be here in Vilnius. As you said at the start, I wasn't supposed to be here. We hope that my colleague Dan Sang-lon from the Kachinland Research Center would be able to join either in person or virtually, but that wasn't able to take place, so I'm here in his stead. I've been based in Asia, working in Asia for almost a decade, between the Philippines, Myanmar, and now based in Thailand. The work of the Asia Foundation and the work that we do through the XCEPT program, we cover Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. But I'll predominantly be talking on the work that we've done in Myanmar over the last 5-6 years through the XCEPT program. I was sitting with Dong San-lon on Tuesday. It's Thursday, so 2 days ago in Bangkok. And I asked him to describe the corruption as he sees it in Myanmar. And he described it as mundane and benign, yet pernicious. And so the corruption as we see it in Myanmar, it's part of the everyday patronage networks that govern everyday political life and the political economy of the country, and the interactions that take place both within and between communities across the country. And I want to give an example of from a little while back, but I think it's a useful example of the ways in which development, the political economy, and corruption are interwoven in Myanmar. So I won't get too much into the locations and the technicalities, but about 20 years ago, there was a ceasefire between the Myanmar military and a non-state ethnic armed organization called the KIA, the Kachin Independence Army. And so there was a project to build a road between two reasonably sized towns, Myitkyina, which is the state capital of Kachin State, which borders China, and a town called Bamo, which is one of the key towns that you have to pass through that links the northeastern Myanmar with Mandalay and then down into the rest of the country. There wasn't a road between a paved road between these cities. So about 20 years ago, a contract was given to a local tycoon who ran a company called the Chatham Myanmar Company to build this road. And the KIA, being a non-state armed group, didn't have funds to be able to contribute to this project. What they did have was access to resources. And so a deal was struck where the KIA essentially gave the Chatham Myanmar Company access to logging permits to be able to then log the land, to be able to take those profits from that and then feed that into the development of this road. And that agreement was facilitated through the familial networks that existed between those within this company and the non-state armed group, the KIA. This type of corruption is commonplace and everyday and underpins the basic business environment and the business concessions that take place in Myanmar, whether that's from logging to gold mining, rare earth mining, in the formal sector, and even those that are in the informal and criminal sector. Bribes and this sort of corruption, they bring in people from the local church networks, local business actors, schools, government actors, armed groups, community leaders are all part of these networks that are involved in the everyday corruption that sort of sustains in Myanmar. And similar to what Renard's saying, this isn't a bug. This is a feature of the political economy in Myanmar and how the day-to-day business happens across the patronage networks. So because of this, it's directly entwined with that everyday corruption is directly entwined with the 70 years, the 7 decades of conflict that have existed in Myanmar. And they have grown together and expanded together side by side over those decades. And a really quick term that we use often, there was a term popularized by an academic, Kevin Woods, called ceasefire capitalism. It has particular meaning for Myanmar, but I think it covers a lot of different conflict environments that we look at. And essentially, a setup in which the Myanmar military was engaged for many decades in creating ceasefires with non-state armed groups, local militia and others, essentially to bring them onto their side, to be able to partner and to be able to form an alliance with these non-state armed groups. In turn, for the Myanmar military to turn a blind eye and Myanmar authorities to turn a blind eye to the illegal or illicit or other economic activities that were taking place in the areas that they controlled. And so essentially, a situation where a political agreement to wrest the conflict and to be able to come up with a ceasefire in an environment so that these non-state armed groups, these militia, can pilfer the resources or other economic activities in these areas carte blanche. Now, these ceasefire capitalism agreements are still in place today, even after the coup. And you see them in parts, and particularly in areas where, border areas where there is heavy extraction of resources, and that flows over borders and into international markets.
Thank you, Nathan. And yes, I think if we don't take away anything else, that idea of corruption being mundane, benign, but pernicious is a great quote to take away. It makes me think of the everyday choices, right? In a lot of places, you have to go to militiaman X or Uncle Y, in order to get something done. It makes me think of actually some other XCEPT research done by Rift Valley Institute on checkpoints, right? That was on checkpoints in Somalia, and it's you just have to pay these things. It's part of everyday life, right? Also, yeah, thank you for picking up again on the patronage networks, and I think this idea of ceasefire capitalism, it speaks very much to that idea of the political settlement entrenching a corrupt system. In that case, very clearly, in order to be able to extract wealth. So thank you. So one thing I want to get into a little bit more is the transnational dimensions of this. XCEPT obviously is a program, it's cross-border conflict evidence. So we're very interested in the transnational dimensions of these issues. So maybe speak just a couple of minutes each on some of the things that you've seen in your area. Maybe Nathan, I'll start with you this time to pick up just on that transnational piece.
Yeah. So. A quick couple of examples. I mentioned the logging deal that was afforded in Kachin state. Teak in Myanmar, we know there is that there is research that teak in Myanmar is smuggled across the border into India and then sold throughout European markets as Indian teak, though it's smuggled from Myanmar, avoiding sanctions and other restrictions on its logging and sale and export out of the country. Jade. 70% of the world's jade comes from Myanmar. And a lot of that is then exported into China and then hits other markets. Rare earth materials. So particularly since the coup, there has been a massive explosion of mining of rare earth materials in the mountainous areas of Myanmar, which is then transported and sold and supplied into Chinese suppliers, and then finds its way into the the EV car batteries that are sold, that are produced by European car manufacturers. Dan Sen Long was in Paris a couple of weeks ago, actually having meetings with European car manufacturers on this point, but because their limit of knowledge extends to, we get these goods from Chinese suppliers, they're not accountable to the extraction and the labor practices and various other poor practices that are taking place within a current conflict coup environment around rare earths. So there are a couple of legal, illicit sort of transnational dimensions that are coming out of the conflict, but then there's also drugs. Myanmar is now, since the Taliban cracked down on poppy growth, Myanmar is now the largest exporter of opium in the world. It is, if not the largest, one of the largest exporters of methamphetamine. And these transnational drug networks extend from the borderlands of Myanmar, China, through a ceasefire capitalism deal with a group called a narco political state called Wa State, through Southeast Asia and into Europe, Australia, and across the world. And the last one is scam centers. We've seen a massive growth of what is being titled as Pig Butchering Scam Centers, which have been established and set up in these contested governance areas of Myanmar on the borders of China and Thailand in particular, where not only is significant sums of money being extracted from, I think there was reports of about 50 billion US extracted from the US last year alone through scamming operations that were running out of Myanmar. But in addition to that, we're seeing significant amounts of human trafficking. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are being trafficked into Myanmar to work in these scam centers, coming not just from South and Southeast Asia, but even Europeans are coming into these centers. That number seems crazy. It sounds unreal. But following the collapse of one of these scam centers on the China border in October last year, 40,000 Chinese were saved from this one scam center. So these numbers, the point that I'm trying to make, and I'll just finish up quickly, is it's easy to think of a problem like Myanmar as a contained crisis a long, long way away from us here in Europe or elsewhere. But the globalized system that we work in, global society and the global economy, it's intrinsically linked into the conflict in Myanmar. And by turn, where these global networks play a significant role in perpetuating the illicit networks and the conflict that takes place in the country.
Thank you, Nathan. And yeah, you're picking up there a few kind of key XCEPT themes, the mixing of the licit, the illicit, all of these transnational flows. So Renard, maybe I'll come to you next just to focus in on that transnational dimension and why that makes the problem so much more difficult to solve.
Sure. I mean, I think in our case study, the obvious transnational conflict right now is the post-October 7th Middle East. Following Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's attack on Palestine, you've seen the war not contained, let's say, to one geography, but spread across several countries, and so clearly transnational. But if we unpack that and say, what makes this transnational? Because the boring definition of transnational conflict is conflict just goes across borders. But what does that actually mean? And I think what you see in somewhere like the Middle East, where you have these colonial structures of states that were built 100 years ago by foreigners, in most of the countries that we're looking at, you have both authority and violence that doesn't map on geographic maps, but that is spread across. And so supply chains become one example of ways in which economic authority goes across countries. So in the example of the axis of resistance, which is these groups, these armed groups of across Lebanon, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, are linked to Iran. And Iran has significant authority, therefore, in multiple jurisdictions through its relationships with these. And at times, these are economic relationships. There's a lot of trade. And again, I think the mundane point here is important. It's not just trading weapons and money, but it's also trading tomatoes or bread or anything where you could make profit. And so it's corrupt. It's taking advantage of the impunity and corruption in these states to have authority. And so that fuels the conflict. That fuels these conflict actors that are now at war with each other, and it does spread all the way across Europe. Of course, the US, the UK, and other countries are very much involved in this conflict and this sort of direct war. I think, if you look at it, you can look at conflict in a very local sense. So you can be at a checkpoint, or you could be at a port, and you can see things coming in and out, and it seems like this is corruption and conflict at the local. But that is obviously then going to be connected to the national, because political settlements in these countries, entrenched corruption, govern and take advantage of these hubs, transit hubs, production hubs, all of these different supply chains. But it's also transnational, because you need a bank account in the UAE, for example, or you need a bank account in Beirut, for example. You need a supplier from Asia, for example. You need a sort of distributor somewhere else. So in so many ways, authority and therefore violence is transnational. And again, if I go back to the example of medicine, if we look at why a country like Lebanon or a country like Iraq is receiving medicine, changing the labels so that it no longer looks expired, or creating it, the medicine isn't only coming from this region. It's a lot of this medicine is actually coming from the West. European companies, American companies are selling about to expire medicine to these countries who clearly change the label and sell it to the people. And so you have this really troubling dichotomy of all of this stabilization work and all of this money being spent to stabilize countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and at the same time, medicine being sold that's incredibly destabilizing to these countries. And on top of that, political settlements and elite bargains being facilitated that entrench the corruption. So there is, so this makes it really transnational, but it shows you that, you cannot solve the Lebanon crisis by only focusing on Lebanon and talking only to the Lebanon teams. And I think that's one of the challenges of international policy making in this region.
And we will get onto that in a bit more
Sorry.
depth in a second. But before we do, Tim, in terms of your case study, obviously you mentioned human trafficking, people smuggling. Can you go into that a bit more?
Absolutely. I think it's a perfect encapsulation of a transnational problem connected to this nexus of crime, conflict, and corruption that we were mentioning earlier. So, of course, what happens after 2011 with the collapse of Libya's security sector is actually a pretty rapid expansion of Libya's illicit sector. And shortly thereafter, a very close interest being taken by the armed actors that control territory in different parcels of the country, to the extent that taxing the movement of goods and providing protection in return for funding becomes a kind of dominant model across the country. And just as Erica was noting about drug supply chains and the impact on Mali, of course, this provides the ability of the smuggling sector, which had always existed in Libya, to really scale up rapidly. And just to put that into context with a number or two, it would have cost about $1,000 or so to cross the Mediterranean in 2011. By 2016, at the height of the numbers crossing, that figure was around $60, because these groups and these networks have become integrated transnationally to organize the movement of people. And so this kind of perfect storm, whereby the state isn't really functioning, it's not providing the services, not distributing things in the way that it should, but this illicit sector, corrupt activities delivering such a large amount of money to contending groups, and people also that just want to be able to buy a house or live their lives, leads to a really rapid expansion of the sector. But of course, the impact that has on Europe leads to a clampdown. And unfortunately, in keeping with some of the things that Renard has said, this so-called border externalization effectively seeks to cut deals with the people who are facilitating the smuggling in order to stop it. So the research that we've done, we found some very interesting things in one key Libyan city called Zawiya, where smuggling is very prominent, in that the local security actors, who are also representatives of the Ministry of Interior and supposed to be responsible for stopping smuggling, are presenting themselves locally as facilitators of smuggling because the locals want the migrants out, while simultaneously presenting themselves as disruptors of smuggling to the internationals in order to obtain funds. And that breeds this kind of transactionalism which feeds upon a degree of known corruption and has effectively created this kind of regulation of the sector of human smuggling and trafficking from Libya, whereby the armed groups and the smugglers know, and the authorities know, that they need to allow a certain amount of smuggling, which they can profit from, to continue in order to ensure that the Europeans will continue to pay them to stop it. And this, I think in a way is the perfect encapsulation of that conflict economy that I was talking about a moment ago, because effectively it creates the incentives for maintaining the system as it currently works, maintaining the penetration of institutions by armed groups and the deals with politicians, as opposed to coming to a consensus on legitimate government or something like moving towards democratic processes. So it's become pernicious and self-feeding in that sense. And the transnational elements have played a key role in actually exacerbating that system. So conflict starts it, and then there's this kind of feedback loop which ripples out and ripples back in, which has really got Libya stuck in quite a vicious cycle.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, that's a very powerful example, I think, in terms of what happens when there's a clampdown and the ripple effects of that through the conflict system that you described. And Erica, I'll come back to you now.
Right.
In terms of those transnational elements, I know you've been looking at specifically transnational organized crime, so that's obviously a central part of what you've been doing research on. Can you talk a bit to that?
Yeah, so we specifically looked at transnational organized crime and illicit economies, and it's similar to what Dan was saying. I mean, when you're talking about trafficking in persons, you're talking about sort of the drug chains that transit from Latin America through West Africa up into Europe. These are inherently transnational illicit trade networks. But even more than that, and even when you're talking about local, so you're talking about artisanal gold mining that's happening in Mali, or diamond mines that are happening in CAR, the way that they're getting out of country to the tune of tens of millions of dollars of illicit profits per year is through these transnational criminal networks and armed groups. But at the same time, when we think about transnational, why we care about these, why are they a transnational threat? I really want to highlight what has come to increasing concerns in terms of this overall phenomenon. So in the early 2000s, a lot of people thought about these organized crime actors or networks as being very locally or regional networks. So really problematic and pernicious in terms of what they had locally, but not something that's truly, operating at the scale.
I think she wants you to slow down.
Oh, sorry. I've been told to slow down, so I'll just halt altogether. Super smooth. But in any case, so yes, you go from where they are these localized predatory actors to what one expert I talked to described as sort of these transnational megafauna. They are no longer just operating in a small space, but they're operating globally and commanding industries, whether it's timber or drug narcotics, that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And that scale, that level of organization that it allows, it not only can be much more disruptive in any given environment, but it's certainly the sort of thing that our existing regulatory tools, whether you're talking about our peace and security mechanisms, or maybe some of the transnational regulation markets that you all are involved in, are not equipped to handle that level of organization and sophistication. And I think the final transnational element that I'd emphasize is also what's the transnational response. So I'm coming at this from a UN perspective. That's the focus of our study. In the Secretary General's recent, attempt to refocus and think about the future responses to peace and security, his new agenda for peace, he described organized crime as one of these transnational interlocking threats, the key to which is not only that it has transnational implications, but because it's bigger than any one state, it's something that can only be responded to through coordinated and coherent international efforts.
Thank you, Erica. And let's get into that in a bit more detail now. I see we build ourselves as policy implications and solutions, so we better actually provide some. So maybe what I'll do is I'll smoosh a couple of questions into one, which is first looking at, okay, what have the responses been so far? You mentioned some of them. Tim mentioned in terms of a clampdown on a specific human trafficking hub and the effect that that's had. But what are the responses been so far? Why haven't they worked? What should we be doing instead? Erica, maybe I'll come to you first this time.
Okay, great. So we looked at what were the different multilateral responses that were happening. Particularly, we looked, because we're coming at it from a UN framework, at what were some of the UN peace operations and missions doing to this. And we have seen some efforts in the last couple of decades. So we've seen increasing efforts to say, build this into the mandate, to at least have analytical and intelligence units within peace operations that would be tracking some of these organized crime and political economy dynamics so that the mission would respond to them. We've also even more seen, both within UN peace operations, but also lots of other multilateral and bilateral assistance, efforts to do sort of technical responses or capacity building. So think about support to local police or law enforcement, support to local prosecutors or judicial organs, in some cases standing up specialized police units or other specialized capacities to work on that. Another key area that we've seen increasing activity in is in terms of sanctions. So both UN sanctions regimes increasingly noting that one of the designation criteria would be connections to organized crime or financing and listing based on that, but also a lot of activity of this happening in bilateral or multilateral sanctions regime and some listing, that this being a way to capture that nexus between conflict and some of these trafficking. And then final, it's not new, it's been happening. There are lots of modes of transnational regulation, whether sector specific, so like the Kimberley process with sort of diamond mines, to efforts to create international conventions to regulate this, like the United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention, which with 192 parties is one of the most widely ratified conventions. We also saw interesting examples of individual states' efforts to respond to this in their domestic regulation, having an impact in some cases in the countries. So in the Central African Republic, there was an interesting case where US domestic regulations related to trafficking in persons and the fact that the CAR government's response for basically tripping that criteria, threatening funding cuts, prompted them to take a more decisive action in terms of passing new laws and in terms of enforcement on trafficking in persons. So you do sometimes see those individual member state actions having an effect in these different places. But I want to emphasize, though, that one of the shortages that we saw, and maybe we can get to this more in question and answer, there were lots of these different tools and approaches out there. There were lots of actors involved. There was one study suggesting that 79 out of 102 UN entities had organized crime somehow in their mandate. But the problem was that while it was relevant to everybody, it was a priority to none. And so what resulted was that often it fell through the cracks, or it simply didn't get that level of political will and buy-in that would have actually have been necessary for it to be operationalized. So all of that technical capacity building for judicial and law enforcement, it's great, but if you're a police officer, it doesn't matter how wonderful that training was if, this massive cocaine shipment, the person that's authorized it links right up straight to the chief levels of government. Or there were a couple of examples also where, in the Central African Republic, for example, there had been some efforts to respond to illicit trade in diamonds or with gold mining, but as a result of a lot of the recent conflict dynamics and the bringing in of the Wagner Group to support the forces of the CAR government in responding to armed groups, a lot of those mining concessions, yes, they've been taken away from territories that were controlled by armed groups, but now they've simply been ceded to the Wagner Group. And so it's simply trading where that corruption or where that network is happening, rather than having the political will to actually kind of address the linkages that are going on.
Thank you, Erica. I think, there's some quite concrete recommendations there, or at least reviews, in terms of having those kind of intelligence units within peace support operations, the technical responses, capacity building, sanctions, international conventions. But I think central to what you were saying was that point that tackling organized crime is in everyone's or in lots of mandates, but it's not a priority. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think that's a very helpful point. Tim, we'll come to you. What's been the approach so far? Why hasn't it worked? What can we do better?
Well, I think the approach so far has been sort of undermined by the approach to resolving conflict being at cross purposes with other interests, such as the migration sector. And I would say fundamentally that corruption has been seen as an acceptable externality, because fundamentally the way that deals have been sought in Libya has involved fewer and fewer key elites seeking to cut a deal among themselves over how they should govern. But of course, if these are the very elites that are controlling the economy diverting ever-increasing funds from the oil sector, setting up their own oil services companies, undermining state-owned enterprises, and basically driving corruption, then the idea that these individuals will get together in an enlightened fashion and forge a different system is not the way that it's shaked out. And so I think that the response so far has kind of been seeking to go with the grain. But actually, what that's done inadvertently is reinforced conflict dynamics and entrenched crime and corruption. And I think if you look at Libya at the moment, you'll see the same number of names who should be in the deals. This person needs to agree with that person. And if you read the coverage, you would think that these people are mortal enemies. But in a way, they kind of need each other because they've got a division of the resources between them, and they know that none of them can control the whole state. So that system needs to shift and needs to be shifted. So a systemic problem requires a systemic solution. So I guess on the solution side of it, 5 interconnected points. Well, firstly, Western policymakers need to align the goals of their policy tools and understand how pushing in one area, for example, irregular migration, might actually undermine the things that they're funding on the other side of the aisle in terms of conflict. And migration is a particularly difficult political issue, but certainly it's quite straightforward to argue that improving Libya's governance will actually mitigate the problems of irregular migration in a much more sustainable manner than the current transactional deals do. Secondly, rather than dealing with the most corrupt kleptocrats in the country and giving them sole dominion over the negotiations, the political process has to be significantly more inclusive. And unfortunately, we haven't seen enough support for civil society in Libya, people who have been trying to uncover and report upon the worst behaviors of some of these corrupt actors. And I think on that front, the third point is that there needs to be an international approach which actually targets this corruption problem, seeing it as part of the core of the conflict. And so there needs to be clearer efforts to help rebuild checks and balances in the Libyan finances. Just to give you one stat, because of an accounting trick, effectively Libya's expenditure went from about 19 or 20 billion dollars public expenditure in 2021 to maybe 35 billion dollars a year later, just because things were going off the books. So starting and really engaging on these issues and applying pressure is important. I think this highlights a real gap that I see in terms of political engagement in conflict-affected areas, where there needs to be an economic track of negotiations that is not simply a technical support from the World Bank for public finance management. No, it needs to accept that the economy is a key part of the conflict that needs to be resolved along with the conflict itself. And I think where that doesn't work, there also needs to be pressure, because there are so many transnational elements of Libya's conflict in terms of corruption that we could delve into, not least the partnerships with regional players in Turkey, in the Emirates, states that are supporting Libyan kleptocrats to divert wealth. So that there has to be some pressure and some consequence for these players if they continue to undertake these actions. And I think finally, the fifth point, and something that's been particularly weak in Libya, is that there hasn't been enough emphasis on the impact of these activities on people. I think Derna was a perfect example, just thousands of dead. Actually, the number that died probably is similar to the number of people who've died in violent conflict since 2011. But there needs to be an emphasis on highlighting the cost of these activities. It's not benign. It's really, really not benign. Focusing on, I think, the issues that affect people in their daily lives. So some of the work that I've been doing also has led people to talk about the medicine sector, which is controlled by a set of militias in Libya, making subsidized medicines impossible to obtain in some places. building social accountability on these issues, while hard, I don't see that there's a technical route that can get around it. There has to be the engagement of the public in these issues that matter. And I think that's actually an area in Libya where there is still quite a lot of currency.
Thank you, Tim. That's a very clear set of proposed solutions, and I think very important as well to, why we're all here. That final point about highlighting the impact of this corruption and the structural violence that's involved in that. Renard, do you want to talk to solutions, policy implications in your region?
Sure. I think recently there was an American. A senior American described their policy to me, I think better than any academic I've heard. And it's not very academic, but he said it's whack-a-mole. And in Iraq and Lebanon, we've seen in this conflict axis of resistance, it's sanctions, military strikes to remove the bad apples. As another person told me, to remove the sort of cancerous tumors and somehow hope that the rest will automatically turn into a great liberal democracy without actually building any of the mechanisms that could move to it. So the challenge becomes, I think right now there's a realization that the sort of liberal democracies aren't going to work in the Middle East. So there's a move away from elections and even a move more towards political settlements. Okay, let's bring everyone together. But what's missing in this conversation is accountability. It's not enough, it is not sufficient to have a political settlement and hope that down the line, these elites that have now been put into this government will say, we should hold each other to account. That is not enough. And so the question then becomes, where does that pressure come from? I think Tim is talking about pressure which is important coming from the top in terms of Western officials who regularly engage with these countries that have given up on liberal democracy but somehow think political settlements could lead to stability. But I think where I see, in at least the countries I work on, the real pressure still coming from is from the populations. And we know that these elites, as repressive as they can be, are still to some extent answerable, to some extent, to the population. This is why the ideology of anti-corruption is important. But what we've seen in a country like Iraq, for example, is 20 years of support to civil society organizations, to journalists, capacity building, all of this, but a sort of lack of coherence, perhaps, and strategy across the board, both from the organizations, but also on topics. And so one example is security sector reform. All of us are talking about countries in which armed actors are powerful, but to siphon them off as security sector actors is also insufficient because they, as we're discussing, are more than security sector actors. They're political, they're economic, they're social, and therefore a solution does not have to be in the security sector to bring it to sort of trying to make more accountability. A solution can be in the health sector where they're weaker, because if the people understand how corruption is every day harming them, this gives these elites a difficult position. So I think it's less about trying to come up with this monopoly over legitimate violence on the top, an acceptance of what reality is, and moving towards what are more accountable structures. And one example would be to bring together to develop this pressure by bringing together, for example, there are certain bureaucrats across these governments who are still there and who are still believing in reform and who are disgusted by what's happening every day. But every one of them always tells us that they feel that they're isolated. They feel weak, they feel alone. Strengthening the connective tissues, I think, between those bureaucrats, who are the only ones who know how to turn the lights on in these ministries, with civil society, with lawyers, in a safe way, and find areas of entry, whether it's environment. You could do security sector reform by environmental reform, because in many of these countries, these security actors are benefiting from issues that are linked to environment. So it's about understanding the bigger picture of the system and being able to understand points of entry, but focusing on the problem being that these are states of impunity, and so that impunity needs to be picked away at.
Thank you, Renard. And yes, I think you're making the case very strongly about which everyone's touched on, about how this is a system. And actually, there's something Tim mentioned as well, how given that maybe the entry point for SSR might not be exactly on that, it might be somewhere else. That's an interesting way of thinking about that. Nathan, do you want to talk about solutions, responses?
Yeah. I'll try and boil this down to 3 succinct points, obviously, as challenging as that can be. Renard, similar to what you're saying about Iraq and the 20 years of lessons learned, I guess, from state building and development that has gone into Iraq, I think Myanmar itself poses a really interesting case study to understand the ways in which conflict, corruption, democracy, and development all entwine and are interwrapped in this environment. And so the 10 years of the democratic or quasi-democratic experiment in Myanmar obviously failed in 2021. But looking back at those 10 years does bring out some really interesting examples of the types of activities that can work, or the types of improvements that you might start to see around corruption in different countries. The hundreds of millions of dollars that went into Myanmar for good governance programming, state building, accountability, programs that my organization, the Asia Foundation, were running really mundane stuff of working with with state and regional governments, so subnational governments on budget preparation and fiscal finance, and being able to train and build up the capacity of civil servants at the local and sub-regional, subnational level to be able to do the work of governance and good accountability that we see. Those sorts of programs did have success in being able to improve some of these dynamics in Myanmar. And even a situation like, I mentioned the scam centers before, a city called Shui Koko on the Myanmar-Thailand border, which is about 15 kilometers north of the main cross-border trading hub between Myanmar and Thailand. That city was being heavily scrutinized, and there was a lot of work being put in by the former NLD government of Aung San Suu Kyi to crack down on the activities in this border town. All of that has faded away since the start of the conflict. So, and that city is now one of the major scam centers where human trafficking is going on, and money is being scammed out of from across the world. And so the lesson here is that, and the first point that I'm coming to is that you can't address corruption and these illicit networks in a sustainable fashion without addressing the underlying conflict dynamics. 10 years of good work that went into Myanmar is all being taken away in the last 3 years since the coup. The second point that I want to quickly come to is around who gets a voice in these conversations that we're talking about. And far be it for me to be another white man talking about solutions for Myanmar, and I wish my colleague could be here. But I think there is a tendency in international fora for us to sort of gloss over the intrinsic and precise details in a situation Myanmar, because it is complex, it is hard to understand. And that's why you get these black and white adjudications based on quantitative data about where different countries rank around transparency or corruption or otherwise. But understanding the complexity within these governance systems and the corruption that takes place is important. The corruption of a non-state armed group that's been performing governance activities for large territory and population for 70 years, including justice mechanism, education, and otherwise, is different to a narco gang that is extracting resources through logging and producing drugs to send into the network. And being able to work with the actors that are part of a political system and are providing governance or development or other activities versus those that are outside of that is important. And the only way you actually understand those details is through local engagement and being able to work with local partners on the ground, civil society, governance actors, government actors, to be able to work on improving the not so bad stuff and help to eliminate the stuff that's not mundane and has really significant impacts on people's everyday lives. The third point, quickly, is I think we need to broaden the conversation. That's why I was excited to be here, to be able to talk about a conflict situation like Myanmar amongst people who aren't peace builders or development experts per se, but are working in finance, the economic sectors, because when you're talking about a conflict situation in Myanmar or corruption in Myanmar, it's a whole package situation. You need to be able to, and if you're working on economic issues, you need to be able to understand where that intersects with conflict environment and aspects like that. So broadening that conversation and who feeds into it, the conflict, trying to address a conflict environment like Myanmar. But on the flip side, also when you're trying to work towards a peace process in Myanmar or elsewhere, it can't just be a conversation between those that hold the guns. It can't just be a conversation between the military, armed groups and others, but you need to bring in the business actors, the community leaders, those that are involved in licit and illicit economic activity. Because as we've hopefully conveyed through this panel, it's a political system, and that these political and economic settlements need to be addressed within the larger efforts to bring peace and address conflict in these environments.
Thank you, Nathan. That's three very clear points, and I think very important to highlight the importance of who gets a voice. And I do just want to plug some other XCEPT research being supported by the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, on the Uganda-Kenya border and Kenya-Somalia border, which is kind of community action research, really trying to put the community at the center of the research and the analysis and the policy action as well. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes for questions from you guys. I think we'll probably take about 3 questions at a time. If you could introduce yourself maybe we'll go here first. If you could introduce yourself first and then ask your question. Try to keep it succinct, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Neha Wadekar. I'm a journalist based in Nairobi, and I was wondering if any of you might be able to talk at all about the conflict in Sudan. And what you have seen or are seeing in terms of corruption being a driver of that conflict. I realize that it's still ongoing, so things are changing, but whatever you have.
Thank you very much. I think there was a hand up here at the front as well. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Raymond Baker with Global Financial Integrity. 20 and 30 years ago, there was a good bit of conflict between transnational organized criminal groups and terrorist organizations. It does appear that over the last 10 or 15 years, that's morphed into often cooperation between these two groups. Is that an accurate assessment from your viewpoint?
Thank you. And then there was also a question here in the middle of this third section. Oh, there's one next to you. There you go.
Hi, sorry, thank you a lot for the discussion today. So I'm Mohammed Beno, I'm with Transparency International Defense and Security, and these questions are exactly the things that we love working on. So you've mentioned a lot the non-state armed groups, but we also mentioned the importance of looking at the defense sector in different countries. So we have a Government Defense Integrity Index, which looks at the resilience of governance systems in different countries. And what we see is that despite the arms exporter countries, the biggest ones in the West, have a good integrity score, they are the main exporters to some very low integrity countries. So, and we see this a lot in Mali, and it creates a lot of tensions and the series of coups in the Sahel, with a lot of lack of trust in governments due to the corruption that's happening. And we see that there is an increase in defense spending, and that doesn't reduce conflict. So, I mean, you've mentioned the need to have a cohesive, foreign policy to make sure that what we do here doesn't. And I just wanted to add that angle of the defense sector, so the official military as well, which is quite opaque, and I think that's also to be considered in this discussion, which supports, I mean, transnational crime only happens by bribing officials in those rights. So, but thank you a lot for all of the really rich conversation.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take one more. I'll read these back. So yes, do you want to ask with the watch? Yeah.
Hi, this has been really interesting. My name is Nicole Martini, and I work for WWF International. I spent a long time working on Somalia and also have worked with XCEPT before, and their research, which is brilliant. And I feel like the context many of you described there are quotes in there that basically could have been Somalia, in particular the Libyan context, which is really sad and fascinating. And I guess now I work on environmental conflict and its nexus with sort of environmental loss. And I'm trying to think a little bit about sort of your remarks, and I think coming from a peace building world or background, looking from a conflict lens, often there's a primacy put on the cessation of hostilities and getting into a discourse around political settlements. Environmental considerations are often, quite frankly, deprioritized. And I would be really interested to just understand, as I'm trying to get into this world, like, what are the alternatives? Are there mechanisms that could facilitate a discourse, an elite bargain that is more oriented towards something? Because in some of the contexts that you're talking about, I'm thinking in particular of Myanmar, the conflict nexus, the reason in many instances for perpetuating the conflict is inextricably linked from the ability it proffers to exploit the natural resources that are there.
Thank you very much. Okay, so a few different questions there. Firstly, whether on the conflict in Sudan, I would recommend you look up one of Chatham House's colleagues and also a lead researcher on XCEPT, Ahmed Soliman, who's doing his case study is Sudan's borderlands. But Eric, I don't know if you have anything to say, and maybe you could also talk a bit about that point on the terrorism crime nexus.
I'll actually start with Raymond's point there on the narco-terrorism, as it's often coined within it. And yes, there's been a lot of evidence. This was definitely a running theme or concern throughout different types of intervention, stabilization in Mali. I want to be cautious because while certainly there can be some cooperation happening between terrorist groups in Mali and other types of armed groups, there was always a concern that was somewhat overstated. So a lot of evidence that actually the terrorist organizations that were in Mali were kind of making their money off of ransoms and also more illegal taxation of communities. They were getting it from other forms of support versus actually it was often the signatory armed parties that were more controlling some of the drug trade and the other bit. But nonetheless, there are linkages there. I also worked in Afghanistan for years, and it's impossible to completely divorce some of the terrorist elements there from some of the narcotics trade. So it is a concern. I would also be cautious though, because this is one of the other findings that we had, is that because these are also interconnected and they are both economic, they're entrenched in political systems, sometimes the tendency, I think, among policymakers can be to focus on that one element, on the ways that organized crime supports terrorist financing. And not only does that kind of miss all of these other elements that are driving conflict and dragging down governance, but it means that because you're missing all these other pieces, you're not going to end up with a holistic response. So I think there's a lot of caution now on, has that been too overstated? Not saying that it's not there. And then just while I've got the floor, I'll also just pick up on the really helpful comments emphasizing the role of government actors. And absolutely, I think that's the point, is that non-state armed groups are involved, but equally complicit are government actors. So the level of trafficking that was happening in northern Mali would have been impossible without the complicity of some of the military actors involved. In fact, a lot of the arms smuggling may not have been coming from outside of the borders, but just be recouped military assets from the military that was resold. And then on your point on military budgets and transparency, this has been a big issue for a sort of public accountability transparency issue in both Mali and the Central African Republic, because there, as I mentioned, there have been Wagner Group operations supporting the militaries in both countries for a number of years. It's quite pricey. How are they being paid? it's interesting that increases in the military budget have tracked what estimates would be of what it would be take to pay them, or just looking at the diversion of assets. So as I mentioned, in the Central African Republic, they've kind of taken over a lot of mining sites, including the largest industrial gold mining site, which has estimated potential revenues of 290 million a year. So this is a huge amount of money, and something that could be public funds or public support in very poor countries. Yeah.
And does anyone want to pick up on that question of how to make sure that when there is this political settlement, it includes, it doesn't just disregard or deprioritize environmental issues, especially when the environmental issues, we all know there's transnational organized crime involved in those. I don't know, does that resonate with any of your case studies? Probably Nathan, maybe most with in Myanmar. I'm just coming off the top of my head. But.
This is where my partner needs to be here. She wrote a paper with Dan Seng Lon many years ago on some of these issues in Kachin State around logging and mining of the environment. But the incentive within an environment like Myanmar, and the reason why another reason why corruption is such a key part of that, is because in that conflict space, you need to act quickly. And so this idea that there will be regulations against, labor laws or other sort of like environmental protections or whatever it might be put in place are superseded by the fact that even when there is a ceasefire, you are operating in a fragile, conflict-affected environment, and the emphasis is on extracting those resources and getting them quickly and being able to pilfer that profit. And it's not just the actors that are in that country that are part of that, but it's also the global supply chains that are driving that. I mentioned the rare earth materials that are being extracted from Myanmar. Part of the reason why that, this industry would not be so rampant and egregious as it is right now if there wasn't a global supply chain that was seeking these materials to be able to fuel the EV car boom that we're seeing. So I don't have an easy answer, I'm sorry, on that. Can I touch on a few other quick questions while I've got a microphone? Also on Sudan, I recommend looking at the work that's been done by the Rift Valley Institute, our partner. They've released a series of policy briefs in the last 12 months looking specifically at the transnational elements and the ways in which Sudan's neighbors in Chad and South Sudan and elsewhere are being, and the networks that are impacting the conflict there. So definitely look at that. And the last thing about the importance of thinking about the military sector and other sort of government sectors, I did talk a lot about non-state armed groups. I want to very clearly say that the Myanmar military is intrinsically and deeply corrupt institution that has exploited its people for a very long time and are a significant part of the problem. The ceasefire capitalism that you see could not take place without the explicit agreement of local military local military commands and the overall SAC. It's a very key part of that. But I also want to flag that in some of these transit companies, there is also, where there might not be the level of conflict, there is also complicity of government actors that are involved in the corruption. And I won't go into significant details, but I can tell you that the tens of thousands of people that have been trafficked into Myanmar to work at scam centers are not flying into Yangon. So take your own view on what I'm saying there.
Thank you, Nathan. Tim, Renard, you don't have to, but do you want to respond to any of those points, or
I wanted to
another couple of questions?
Come back on the non-state armed actors question from Mohammed, because this is kind of the nub of the problem in a way. All of the Libyan armed groups that I'm talking about are affiliated to the state and are funded by the state. Even when Libya was in rounds of civil war, opposing forces were funded by the state to fight each other. So the issue, we've had long-term debate, discussion about how to describe these groups. But that distinction, which is obviously often absolute in policy terms in the way that people think about things, just doesn't apply. So that makes it much more much more difficult. So on that front, the armed groups would themselves contend that because they don't have access to proper budgeting approaches, they've had to resort to these other forms of revenue generation. I don't think, as you can tell by my voice, that I would buy that argument, but that's certainly part of the discussion. And some people advocate, for example, clearly delineating the funds that go into these groups. But the problem is, because they're competing against each other, they need to have a shinier weapon than the other guy, and that creates this arms race. I'll make two other very brief points. Raymond, on the transnational organized crime and extremist groups, in Libya, the armed groups have been undergoing consolidation and increasing sophistication, as I've mentioned. And in reality, that doesn't leave space for small groups just operating in the middle of nowhere to be able to do that much. In fact, although if you look at a map of Libya, you might think that there would be these entirely ungoverned spaces, there isn't really a grain of sand that isn't territory of one group or another, and anybody that tries to parachute into those areas tends to be very small and doesn't tend to have that much influence. These corridors of smuggling and trafficking are highly lucrative and are controlled at every step of the way by a different set of actors. So in that sense, I don't see them as having a great influence, though there are some from the former Libyan Islamic fighting group who were quite effective in obtaining airlines and other things in the aftermath of 2011. And just the very brief point I'd make, I think, Nicole, your observation that I could have been talking about Somalia, I think is bang on, right? And the modalities of these conflict economies, to me, are comparable, and they have similar challenges that are associated with them. And that also holds when you look at Sudan, Naya, because the way that the RSF seeks to exploit gold supply chains, the way that these revenue generation mechanisms are used by conflict actors, I think is something which we've argued follows similar patterns. Yet, when you look at the political efforts to disrupt, there isn't really a systemic attempt to undermine those models or fit that into the political solution. It just kind of accepts them and hopes that at some point they could be reformed in the future, which, if you look at a case study in the Middle East like Lebanon, I think that's the perfect exemplification that that time never comes, right? Once the deal's done, those interests just become further entrenched, and that ultimately erodes what's remaining of the state's capacity.
Thank you, Tim. We've only got 2 minutes left, so okay, we've probably got time for one more question, maybe two, if we're quick. Yes, okay, let's go here, and then, yeah, there.
Hi, Yamato Rabi.
Quick, please, if you can.
Yamato Rabi, I work for UNDP in Iraq. So my question is about corruption and after the post. Sorry.
No, sorry.
What I see often is that, when we do post-conflict as a result of a settlement, not only we deprioritize corruption, but we willfully ignore corruption. So we build an order that is very much built prone to corruption, encouraging it, allowing different parties that are associated to this order to benefit from the peace dividend and somehow stay together. In one word, stability opposed to corruption. And the question is, can we do things differently? Because so far I've not seen any political settlement or peace accord that has a strong integrity provisions. Can we do things differently and build different orders?
Thank you. And the final question there.
Yeah, my name is Ghassan. I'm managing consortium funding programs in Palestine, including current grants to Gaza. And I will be very quick. I have very quick observation and a question. And the observation is I agree with all the panelists that there is the vicious cycle of corruption, conflict, poverty, and insecurity, and it's spin off. And it has been going on since the last 10 to 15 years. The observation that we notice is that, of course, you all hear the news. I will not talk about stagnation, suffering, and death, but I wanted to say that in the conflict, corruption becomes normal. So it's normal that the Gazans, they go to the border, they want to flee, then border police ask them for $7,000. It's normal that the leaders, they cancel elections or they cancel the parliament. And even on the international flora, on the 24th of April, 12 congressmen, American lawmakers, they sent a letter to the ICC persecutor threatening him not to continue his legal process regardless of the results. So within all this accumulated process that started since the last 10 or 15 years under the eyes of the international mechanisms, we have been always wondering about the practices
Sorry, we need to finish. So just on the question.
My question is, have any of the respected panelists analyzed the practices or the work of the transparency and anti-corruption mechanism, the international anti-corruption mechanisms in conflict zones? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and sorry for cutting you off like that. Well, as Renard, I hope you don't mind staying on for another couple of minutes, but as Renard's been waiting very patiently, and both of those questions actually were, could be covered by you, maybe I'll give you the last word. Firstly, on that point, which is, I think one of the main points we've been saying about the short-term stability in a political settlement at the expense of long-term accountability. Maybe you could speak to that, Renard, and then to the gentleman talking about the Gaza situation.
Sure, I think, and Yama, I know we've had many conversations about this. It seems in the Middle East and many places there is a move away from, at least for internationals, I think internationals have now realized we can't just build democracies. We can't show up somewhere and set elections. And it seems like the weird lesson learned from that is let's just have whoever has rules as long as there's some form of stability, because otherwise we break it and it creates ISIS or it creates, issues. And I think that's problematic. I think we're living in the international norm right now of political settlements and elite bargains, which is meant to be a solution to liberal peacekeeping, but it's actually problematic. And I think, therefore, we need to start thinking through how do we bring in accountability at the beginning. It's great to have an inclusive elite bargain. It's important that, that's there, but do these elites represent their populations? And that there's not enough being done there. I think bringing in civil society into elite bargains